It is May the 4th. Happy Star Wars Day. All right. Yes. Joke. So here is your joke. So why was Humpty Dumpty not looking forward to winter? Because he had had a great fall. All right. So what I have for you today is we're going to look at the anti-war movement during Vietnam and where public opinion begins to shift against the war in Vietnam, which is basically what that short essay I'm having you guys write is about, that shift in public opinion. So this is kind of the beginnings of that where it kind of tilts to the other side. So we'll be talking about the anti-war movement in general, which connects to what you did for homework over the weekend with SDS. We'll look at the Tet Offensive. I've got some video clips for you to watch, a newscast actually. And so when you watch that newscast, that's CBS Evening News at 6 o'clock, in the evening, people are eating their dinner, watching that on their televisions. So we have that. And then for homework tonight, I have a couple of anti-war, or actually some Vietnam War songs. Some are anti-war, some are pro-war, for you to listen to and answer some questions on, because the music of this time period is, of course, very influential on the young people. So that's what I have for you. I hope all is well. Stay safe, stay smart, and may the 4th be with you. So today we'll begin looking at the anti-war movement, how the American public begins to kind of turn against support for the Vietnam War, as well as the turning point for the American military in Vietnam, which is the Tet Offensive. So the anti-war movement is best associated with the student group, Students for a Democratic Society, led by Tom Hayden, who you see there on your screen. For homework, you had read the Port Huron Statement, so you're familiar with their goals and aims. SDS was a very popular organization during the 1960s. Again, they started as a civil rights group and then pretty quickly morphed into an anti-war group once you got to 1967. And there were chapters of SDS on thousands of colleges across the country who were mobilizing college kids against the war in Vietnam. And so this anti-war movement begins putting people really into two camps, hawks and doves. Hawks were people who supported the American war effort in Vietnam, supported their government, supported their military, and then you had doves who were against the war, seeking for peace in Vietnam. And again, this also becomes a generational issue, with younger people more apt to become doves, older people more apt to become hawks. And if you look at the demographics of the time period, again, coming out of that baby boom, you have 8 million college-age students. Those 8 million college-age students, again, are being organized by SDS, and they're going to become very vocal against this war. In addition, by the time you get to 1970, half of the entire U.S. population is under the age of 30. So it is a young country. And of course, a young country, they're the ones being asked to fight in Vietnam. And so the draft and opposition to the draft became a fundamental point of this anti-war movement. So had organizations like SDS burning draft cards, and you see an image there. And the way the draft worked, the draft first off is nothing new for Vietnam. The United States has had a draft since World War II, a peacetime draft as well. So even when the country was not at war, young people were still being recruited to become soldiers. And your Do Now activity kind of focused on how the draft worked, and draft lottery. But you did have choices. So if drafted, you could fulfill your military obligation, which would have been a year. You could have also filed as a conscientious objector, which was a hard status to obtain, but about 170,000 people did manage to register as conscientious objectors. And for the most part, those were people that were studying to be priests, ministers, So you can imagine as a result, there was a large uptick in people joining seminaries in the 1960s. You could simply dodge the draft, and over 500,000 Americans fled the draft. Um, when they get their draft notice, they're told to report at a certain date and time, and they just don't show up. That is a crime. Um, some flee the country and go all the way to Canada, where the law can't get them. Um, and then you have others who say, I'm not going to serve in Vietnam, though I don't want to dodge the draft, and so I'll choose prison. You had 3,000 people who chose to go to prison for a year rather than serve in Vietnam. And so, with the American public now agitating in this anti war sentiment, Lyndon Johnson begins a public relations campaign. He brings William Westmoreland back from Vietnam to basically tour the United States in the second half of 1967. And he goes on every television he can, talks to every newspaper reporter he can, gives interview after interview. And the theme is basically the same. We're winning the war in Vietnam. So right now, it would be foolish to kind of turn against it. He talks about there's a light at the end of the tunnel, as you see here in the corner of your screen, that the war is beginning to wind down, that the enemy is exhausted. It's exactly what the American public wants to hear, and they're war weary, and they want to hear that they're winning. They want to hear that the war is coming to a close soon. And then the Tet Offensive happens. In January of 1968, Tet is the Lunar New Year, so it is a holiday in Vietnam. And so both sides had agreed to a ceasefire in honor of the holiday. And the Viet Cong violated that ceasefire and attacked every major American military installation in South Vietnam. Every base, every barracks, anywhere there were troops positioned, they were attacked. Completely catches the Americans by surprise. And the map on the side, you can see where all these attacks are. Now, the Tet Offensive, from a military standpoint for the Viet Cong, is a failure. They don't win everywhere. They're defeated on all accounts. But from a PR standpoint, they win the battle in the long term. Because again, William Westmoreland had been telling the American people that the Vietnamese, or the Viet Cong, were on the point of surrender, that the war was coming to an end. Well, if the enemy was mortally defeated, if the enemy was just about spent, how can the Tet Offensive happen? How can they have this ability? How can they have these numbers? How can they have this organizational presence? And so it looked like Westmoreland didn't know what the heck he was talking about. And then when you combine the fact that this is a televised war, you have American reporters in Vietnam. These attacks are happening in cities. These aren't happening out in the countryside. So Saigon is attacked. So I've linked for you a CBS News report. And again, that news report would have been shown at like 6 o'clock. People are sitting eating their dinner, and that's what they're watching. It doesn't look like we're winning. And again, Westmoreland either comes across as he doesn't know what the heck he's talking about, or worse, he was lying. And so the American public begins to lose faith in their military. And in addition to this, you have Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite was was the anchor of the CBS Evening News. Walter Cronkite was considered the most trusted man in America. And Walter Cronkite went to Vietnam and reported on Vietnam. And in February of 1968, he comes back and does an editorial at the end of his news program in which he basically says, we cannot win the war in Vietnam. The best we can hope for is to negotiate a peace settlement and just to get the heck out. He declares the war a stalemate, to which Lyndon Johnson declares, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, then it's over. I've lost Mr. Average Citizen. On top of all that, you have this gruesome image, which also appears on the front page of American newspapers. And on top of this, this photograph was taken by the Associated Press, but there's also actual video of this, which was filmed by an NBC videographer in Vietnam. And so what you're seeing there The gentleman in the military flak jacket is the commander of basically the national police of South Vietnam. So he is supposedly the good guy. The gentleman on the right is a prisoner. As you see, his hands are tied behind his back. He's handcuffed. He's being brought forth as a prisoner at the end of the Tet Offensive. Um, and he was suspected actually of slitting the throat of a South Vietnamese military official, that official's wife, and their 6 kids. He's brought to the military police um, leader as a prisoner, who then pulls out a gun and shoots him right there on the street, assassination style. And so, again, this image reinforces for Americans, what are we doing? Who are we supporting? Who really are the good guys? How can we support a government that acts this way? This is not how we treat prisoners. Um, and again, all of this is happening in a short window of time, from like the middle of 1967 to the middle of 1968. And 1968 is going to be a trying time for the government and for the country. We've already talked about some things in 1968. 1968 is when Martin Luther King is killed. 1968 is when Robert Kennedy is killed. And in 1968, you're going to have a contentious presidential election, which we can talk about in our next class.